Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are taking a really fascinating journey into the ideological evolution of the 44th President of the United States. We're going to trace a unique philosophical arc, something we might call pragmatic idealism. As you'll see, we're looking at how a leader transitions from being a community organizer, driven by this soaring, unifying hope, to a commander-in-chief who suddenly has to navigate the incredibly heavy, complex, and let's face it, often grim realities of global governance. It's a story of how deeply held ideals clash with and are ultimately shaped by the hard edges of the real world. To really understand the politician, we first have to understand the kid. And his origins? Honestly, they're pretty unlikely. Before he ever walked the halls of the White House, a young Barack Obama spent 4 years of his 1960s childhood living in Indonesia. His world was all about catching crickets and battling swift kites. He ate tough dog meat, even tougher snake meat, and crunchy roasted grasshoppers. But it wasn't just boyhood adventures. As he recounted later on, he witnessed profound hardship. We're talking farmers staring blankly at these barren, cracked fields during severe droughts, and families literally scrambling to save their homes from massive floods. He learned super early on that the world could be violent, totally unpredictable, and often quite cruel. Which brings us to part 1, an improbable American story. That unpredictable childhood eventually led him back to the United States. Fast forward to 2004, and it led him right to the stage of the Democratic National Convention. Now he introduced himself to the entire nation, but not by listing off a bunch of political credentials. Instead, he told the story of his parents. He spoke about a foreign student father, born in a small village in Kenya, who grew up herding goats, and a Kansas-born mother whose own father marched across Europe in Patton's army. It was this improbable love story that bridged entirely different continents. And this speech just brilliantly illustrates his early foundational idealism. He literally framed his very existence as living proof of the American dream. He spoke of a generous, tolerant country where your name is absolutely no barrier to success. This quote right here captures that raw, magnetic optimism. He positioned himself as the total embodiment of an audacious hope, that bedrock conviction that no matter what, there are always better days ahead. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the profound contrast we see revealed over just 5 years. Look on the left, we have the soaring, unifying rhetoric of his 2004 convention speech, where he's insisting that the pundits are completely wrong to slice and dice the country into red states and blue states. But take a look at the right side. Fast forward to 2009. He's now the president. He's standing in Oslo, Norway, delivering his Nobel Peace Prize lecture, and the tone has shifted drastically. He states, plainly and bluntly, evil does exist in the world, and he acknowledges that negotiations alone cannot convince terrorists to lay down their arms. The hopeful unifier had really become a stoic realist. Let's dig into that shift in part 2, the philosophy of just war. So just months into his presidency in 2009, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. This was a deeply controversial decision which he actually openly and neutrally acknowledged. He pointed out the profound irony himself. He was at the very beginning of his labors on the world stage, and even more heavily, he was the commander-in-chief of a nation currently fighting 2 wars. During his acceptance lecture, he publicly wrestled with this huge issue of global security. He spoke of Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, stating that their nonviolence was a moral North Star for him. But, and here's the pivot, he drew a sharp, pragmatic line between being a movement leader and being a head of state. A nonviolent movement, he argued, could not have halted Hitler's armies. As a leader sworn to protect his nation, he concluded there was just no way he could stand idle in the face of threats to the American people. To reconcile this massive moral tension, he outlined the ancient philosophical concept of a just war. This suggests war is justified only when very specific conditions are met. It has to be a last resort, the force used must be proportional, and civilians absolutely must be spared whenever possible. And while he's laying out these heavy academic concepts on the world stage, he anchors it back to the human cost that he recognized back in 2004. In that keynote, he told the story of Seamus, a young, clear-eyed Marine he met at a VFW hall who was heading off to Iraq. He noted our solemn obligation to those we send into harm's way, reminding us that behind all the philosophy of war, there are real service members facing the ultimate sacrifice. Let's move to and see how this builds in part 3, defining the 44th presidency. Over his 8 years in office, his administration faced a deeply gridlocked and highly polarized political environment. Yet that pragmatic idealism we've been talking about translated into historic action that fundamentally altered both domestic and foreign policy. This timeline maps out a few defining milestones. In 2009, he signed the ARA stimulus bill to combat the Great Recession. By 2010, after some massive political battles, the Affordable Care Act was passed without a single Republican vote. Then in 2011, shifting over to foreign policy, he authorized the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, and skipping ahead to 2015, he helped broker the Paris Agreement, where nearly every country on Earth committed to lowering greenhouse gas emissions. These were monumental, highly debated actions that really reflected his willingness to use whatever tools he had available to enact his vision. Looking at the economic data, we can clearly chart the trajectory of the country during his tenure. Remember, he inherited an economy that was in the depths of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. In 2009, unemployment was sitting at a painful 9.3%, and GDP growth was in the negative. But by the end of his first term in 2012, the economy had returned to positive growth. And by his final full year in 2016, unemployment had dropped all the way down to 4.9%, and the federal deficit had been cut by more than half from its 2009 peak. This steady, albeit heavily debated, recovery really defined much of his domestic legacy. The sheer breadth of his policy shifts is a perfect example of the realities of executive pragmatism. On the domestic front, he pushed through the Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform, signed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act as his very first piece of legislation, and used executive action to protect childhood arrivals through DACA. Internationally, he sought to completely shift paradigms. He signed the New START nuclear treaty with Russia, ended decades of hostility with the Cuban Thaw, and brokered the incredibly complex Iran nuclear deal. Whether you view these actions favorably or unfavorably, it was an administration characterized by truly ambitious, sweeping changes. Finally, Part 4, Passing the Torch. After 8 years of navigating the incredibly heavy burden of power, the daily briefings, the partisan gridlock, the military interventions, his post-presidency represents a really fascinating full-circle moment. Through the Obama Foundation, he has essentially returned to the grassroots community organizing that defined his early career, way before he ever entered politics. So the crucial point is this number, 206. What does this represent? Well, this is the highly competitive 2025 to 2026 class of Obama Foundation Global Changemakers. Out of a massive pool of applicants from all over the world, the foundation selected these 206 emerging leaders to participate in regional programs designed to multiply their impact. And these leaders, they span 70 different nations and territories. We have 35 from Africa, 35 from the Asia-Pacific region, 35 from Europe, and over 100 from right here in the United States. Working across government, business, and civil society, these young leaders are out there tackling the climate crisis, expanding education, and strengthening democracy. It's a direct continuation of that exact same 2004 message, equipping the next generation with the tools to take their audacious hope and turn it into tangible, on-the-ground action. Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and to the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves. How will history ultimately balance the soaring, unifying idealism of his rhetoric against the complex and sometimes harsh, pragmatic realities of his governance? It's a tension that completely defined his presidency, and frankly, it's a question that historians are going to debate for decades to come. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this material. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the data, and keep learning. Catch you next time.